same holy boat. Don't you know it ain't right for people to go hungry with all the food being thrown away just because it ain't the right size or perfect, cause you can't turn a fast dollar that way. You know it ain't right to make people grow coffee when their families could be growing food. Working those lands for corporations don't do hungry people no good, cause people need food in their belly, need some drink for the dry in their throat, need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat. People got to have food in their belly, need some drink for the dry in their throat, and need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat. Don't you know it ain't right to cut the trees down just to grow a bunch of cheap hamburger meat? You know those trees, they hold the topsoil, and those burgers aren't fit to eat. And you know it ain't right to punish the farmers for growing food clean and poison free. There ought to be a government who protect them, put tax dollars where they need to be, cause people need food in their belly, they need some drink for the dry in their throat, they need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat.
Hi, my name is Nan Cohen. I'm the producer of Light Television, and I want to welcome you to the global politics of food. Before we start, I want to tell you a little bit about Light Television. The purpose of Light Television is for each of us to work together to bring changes in this world, the kind of changes that empower each and every one of us from our hearts, from within our lives, our everyday individual lives, and we do it together. So that's a little bit about Light Television. There are 2 new Light Television shows coming up. The first one is a week from tonight at 9 p.m. That's Thursday, December 20th. And it re-airs on Saturday, December 22nd at 7 p.m. And then there's Light Television number 5, where various people in the Missoula community speak with me about light and light work. It's very practical conversations. It's the first of many, and it airs on December 27th at 9 p.m., and it re-airs on December 29th at, I believe it's 2 p.m. But check the schedules. So this is the global politics of food. And what we have is we have these panelists with us today, and we also have a video for you called The Global Banquet, Politics of Food by Mary Knoll World Productions. And I'm really grateful to them and to these people who are with me today. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to briefly introduce them. Right here to my right is Cliff Bradley. He's an agricultural specialist working in the United States and Latin America. Here to my left is Larry Evans. He's a mycologist and the owner of the New Black Dog Cafe. And over here to my farther right is Neva Hassanen. She's a PhD and professor of environmental studies at the University of Montana. What we're going to do now is we're going to show the video that we have for you. It is a 50-minute video in 2 parts. Part 1 is entitled Who's Invited? Part 2 is entitled What's on the Menu? So we're going to start with part 1, and then we're going to come back to the panelist. So,
This is prairie ecology here. It's a mixed grass prairie, and I have to go for a walk on the prairie every few days because it really restores me. You know, the grasses and the wind and the wetlands, and all of that is here as a gift from the soil. I think that there's an important, and I'm going to use the word ministry here, there's an important ministry to farmers, because farmers, for the most part, the message which they get is that it is their fault if they aren't succeeding. So picture this. There's a middle-aged farmer, probably in his mid-40s. The farm that he is on now with his family has been in that family for maybe 3 or 4 generations. And now it's his turn, and it's his responsibility. And he has the mandate to pass that farm on to the next generation. But he's in this difficult place where the market does not reward him for what he's doing. And he, for the first time in that long generation of that family, has to face the fact that he's the one that's going to lose it. And there isn't anybody there that's really saying, wait a minute, you know, it really isn't your fault. If farmers at that point decide that they will quit and sell to pay off their debts, very often they find that their assets, while it may cover their debts, will not pay for the income tax bill that they have because they have to pay income tax on the assets which they sell. And that's where many of the suicides come, you know, when farmers recognize that not only can't they continue farming, they can't even quit. And particularly if they have life insurance, they figure that this is a way that, you know, their families at least can cope and can go on. So the suicide rates have been going up dramatically over the last decade.
We have seen a steady erosion of the farms, and every year people are told how many thousands of farms have been pushed out, but it is not because of competition. This is a very direct consequence of a deliberate policy geared towards supporting what was called in the 70s a get big or get out policy. The irony is that as small farmers are replaced by larger farms and more quantities of food are grown, in fact, hunger increases, especially among those who were formerly food producers. And the trade agreements are a big part of this. The argument has been that everyone will rise with the trade policies that countries are now required to put into place. Everyone has been told that consumers everywhere and farmers and countries rich and countries poor will all benefit. And in fact, the opposite has happened. Instead of everybody rising with the tide, people are drowning.
You see big cities like Delhi and Bombay full of people who are migrating from the countryside because we cannot feed ourselves. Almost 2 million small family farmers are being driven off the land. Many of us have heard about Indian farmers drinking pesticides in sheer frustration and committing suicides because they cannot feed their families. So you have a model of a country which was making progress since independence, trying to provide the basic human right to food, to decent standard of living to all its people. And that model has been shattered by this free market prescription which has come from countries like the United States. We are not against trade. In fact, trade has always existed. What we are saying is we are against trade at any cost.
We hear a lot about the free market and its ability to solve social problems as well as to create universal prosperity. I'm a great advocate of the market. I think the market is a terribly powerful institutional instrument if used properly. But it's also understood There are certain things that markets don't do. They do not create equity. They do not respond to social needs of people who do not have money. I mean, that's a reality of the market. It responds to money. So if you get a society as we have now, particularly a global society, in which a majority of the people have very, very little, if any, money, you know, roughly 40% of the world's population that lives on $2 a day or less, the market system simply does not respond.
Countries are forced to open their borders to an influx of products from abroad. And as long as we have that kind of free trade policy, it's very difficult to imagine a way to end hunger. What free trade does is it allows large companies to dominate the markets of local countries, to undercut local farmers, and to destroy the ability of countries to feed themselves in the future. And that really perpetuates and deepens the structures that promote hunger. I think if we're going to seriously deal with hunger, we have to say countries need the ability to design policies that are in accordance with their own needs. We have to take a step back from extremist free trade policies. And if that means protecting basic food production, then so be it.
The price you pay for most of the food you buy on the shelf is almost completely unrelated to the price that we as farmers get for the real nutritious part in the food. As we get lower and lower prices, you're paying higher and higher prices, and all of that profit margin is being garnered in between there by the industrial, the owners of that industrial processing part of the food system, because they control the chemical price, the fertilizer price, the fuel prices, the machinery prices. And when I say they, I'm talking about a handful of corporations, many of the names you would recognize. And those are the people that are doing very well in the food system.
Over the last 3 decades or so, we've had a tremendous consolidation of the global food system in which we've seen mergers, leveraged buyouts, fewer and fewer companies have come to control each step along that food system or that food chain. For example, Philip Morris, a tobacco company, after acquiring Nabisco, is very likely now the world's second largest food corporation after Nestle.
The combination of Kraft and Nabisco creates a real global leader in the food industry. Scale is a real advantage in this industry. As Kraft has proven, it increases both efficiency and effectiveness, leverages our service to the trade, and benefits.
It hasn't made an enormous difference. I mean, food was probably 31% of our revenues. It's now going to be 35% of our revenues. Beer's about 4%, tobacco's 60%. But if you look at the international tobacco opportunities, we have about 16, 17 market share points of the world. So there still remains considerable opportunity out there for us, and we plan to take advantage of it.
We have companies like Archer Daniels Midland and Cargill that together control almost the entire grain trade in the world, and they unilaterally set the price, and they set that price low. Large corporate farms stay in business because they're getting these huge subsidy payments. Small family farmers can't stay in business because they don't have enough acres to get a significant subsidy payment. The subsidy is paid per acre, and because the prices are below the cost of production, they can't survive on what they sell either. So U.S. grain goes abroad, and it's placed in a local economy at prices that are so low that local farmers can't compete. We have small corn farmers in Mexico. They have provided the basic staple food for the entire population of the Mexican nation. They cannot do that if cheap American corn is dumped into the Mexican economy through NAFTA and through these U.S. policies at prices below the cost of production. So they're driven off the land in desperation. They may move to cities, they may move to the United States, or they may even rise up in arms. Thus we have the Zapatista rebellion in southern Mexico, in Chiapas.
So you have this tremendous struggle in many parts of the world for access to land, access to productive land, and that's a particular struggle for women, who want access to that land, not so they can produce crops for export and hard cash, but who want access to that land so that they can grow food to feed themselves and their children. And the corporate interests of the world can't see any profitability there. And they're right. This is about feeding people. It matters whether you're on a rocky hillside or in a fertile valley, whether you can then grow enough food to feed your children and your village and bring food to the marketplace. You have places like Honduras, for example, where I was a visitor among farmers and peasants who were struggling in very adverse conditions there on the hillside to grow beans for their own use.
Sí, la distribución de la tierra es mala debido a
That's
que
right. Land is not distributed fairly because land is controlled by the rich. We poor people, we're pushed to the hillsides.
Veamos que hoy parece que tiene más valor una vaca.
It seems like a cow is worth more than a woman. A stud bull is worth more than a man, and a calf more than a child, because they're eating from the good grazing land and a good level ground, while the poor, we are on the hillsides.
Estamos en las laderas.
The fresh fruit and vegetables that most of us eat are picked by hands of farmers who have been displaced from their own land and are now very low-wage farm workers.
Uno se siente triste, como abandonado, ¿verdad?
You feel very sad, like you have been abandoned. There's no one for you to turn to. Everything comes for you hard. Because, first of all, we don't have any money. We can't even go to the grocery store.
Podemos ir a la pulpería, ¿va?
El hondureño está ganando $2.
In Honduras, you're earning $2 a day. And if you have 8 children and 2 adults, it can be hard to survive. So all the young people do is look towards the United States.
These are people who swell the ranks of the hungry, and they were owner-operators of their own small farms, which they cannot farm because of the drop in food prices as a result of what's come to be known as globalization.
There are really two very different dimensions to globalization, one of which most of us consider to be very positive, and the other which is sparking the protests and the reaction. The positive part is the opening up of global communication and exchange between people, recognizing that we live on one planet, Earth, that we must share and that we must learn to protect the natural systems of the Earth. The other dimension of globalization is how it leads to a loss of democracy as we open up the borders of nations to the expansion of corporations, creating a system of economic rule and economic institutions that are solely engaged in the creation of profits for their shareholders.
Well, right now, the fast food market on the western side is around $300 million in sales. The fast food side on the Chinese side is around $3 billion in sales.
The global market is organized in such a way that only the big players survive, and the biggest players who control the market set the price, and they set the price for the raw product low enough that you can't make a living on your own small place. A low price is always an argument that people want to use to say, well, we can feed more people if food is cheaper. More people will eat. Ironically, that's not how it seems to be working. There's lots of data by now from around the world that plentiful, cheap supply of food is in fact inaccessible to people unless they too are part of a money economy. It doesn't matter to you that bread is only $1 a loaf if you're not making any dollars during the day.
When a large corporation comes forward and says, we want to feed the world, the statement is absurd on the face. because these corporations are only in the business of feeding people who have the money to buy their food. You get the roughly 1.2 billion people in the world who have an income of less than $1 a day. These people are not on the screen of the Monsantos and the Archer Daniels Midlands. They can't make any money selling food to them.
A very powerful myth that for many years American farmers believed was that they were feeding the world, and that all of the suffering of low prices and an impossible economic environment that the family farmer went through in the United States was justified because at least we were feeding the world. Well, it turns out that providing our food cheap to other countries destroys people's ability to feed themselves. It destroys nations' ability to feed themselves.
I think that many people in many different debates have sort of accepted this suggestion that corporate agriculture is necessary to feed the world, that there is scarcity out there, that there is hunger, and the only answer is bigger and bigger agriculture. First of all, scarcity is not the problem. There's enough food in the world right now to feed every woman, man, and child 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day. That's enough to get nice and fat on. Hunger is a symptom of poverty and inequality. And that's what we have to get to the root of if we're going to solve hunger. What we need to get back to is people being able to either feed themselves because they have access to land to do so, or people being able to feed themselves because they have sustainable livelihoods that allow them to purchase food for themselves and their families. That's the end to hunger, not more food production, particularly not the kind of food production we've got right now that's focused on maximum yield per acre, maximum short-term profit for a very small number of corporations.
Sometimes we're confused by the concept of yield. You may say that a 1,000-acre soybean farm produces more soybeans per acre than a 1-acre farm does. What that forgets is the 1,000-acre soybean farm, it's producing only soybeans. The 1-acre farm on that 1 acre is producing soybeans, corn, fruits, vegetables, tree crops, animal products, and when you add all of that together, you see the much greater productivity of the small farm. We've done very careful research at Food First for every country in the world, including the United States, for which data is available, comparing different farm sizes. We find that contrary to that myth, in fact, smaller farms the world over, including in the United States, produce anywhere from 200 to 1,000% more total food per unit area than large mechanized industrial farms. Not only that, the kind of technology that the smaller farmer uses is much more sustainable. Small farmers conserve trees in the agricultural landscape. They do more soil conservation practices than large farmers. They're capable of using methods like organic and other kinds of alternative methods that don't contaminate the soil much more so than large farms. Essentially, what we're doing is we're taking the most efficient, the most productive, and the most sustainable kind of farmers, the family farmer, and we're driving them out of business. And the most inefficient, unproductive, environmentally destructive, and socially destructive kind of farmers, the large corporate farmers, they're staying in business because the larger they get, the more subsidies they get.
If you're one of these large industrial farms, you will not be in a position to pay very much attention to how the land is cared for. The sole objective is going to be to produce as much as possible. And if that means the land is going to be destroyed in 10 or 15 years, it's not going to be much of a concern because the immediate goal is short-term profit, not long-term survivability. My father on this farm, his whole life was devoted to making sure that this farm was in good condition when it was passed on to me. I mean, that was his passion. He never cared about making money. He often said, I want to make enough money to keep the farm operating, but beyond that, it's not of concern to me. So that's a very different mindset about economics from the industrial corporate model. If you're going to farm in a way that takes care of the land, you have to be close enough to the land to know how to take care of it, because land is very different in different places. I learned how to farm here. I know this land. I know every square inch of it. I know what needs to be done to take care of it. I couldn't do it if it were a 50,000 acre farm, because I couldn't be close enough to that much land in order to do it well. Farmers used to regard the soil almost as a sacred thing, because they knew that that's where their food came from, and so they cared for it and had a relationship with it, which was, in every respect that we understand, a love relationship. We were lovers of the soil. Soil is a living thing. It's a living being. Soil scientists now tell us that there are over 2 billion species of microorganisms in a spoonful of soil.
I mean, you can't really see it with the naked eye, but this is filled with microorganic or microscopic organisms, and it smells good. And this is the only fertilizer that we use. And of course, it was produced by these animals. I have a farm that produces pork, lamb, chicken, eggs, vegetables, fruit, fish, beef, all the feeds that we feed our animals. I absolutely love this place, and I love this work, and I love these animals, and I love these plants, and I love to get up in the morning and work 10 hours a day.
Sometimes I feel overwhelmed by how much there is to do, but on the other hand, the rewards of living here, you know, all the little life coming up. We have a lamb who should have died when she was born. She fit into Henning's hand. And we had to stomach tube her, and we were up for 24 hours with her, and we started feeding her round the clock every 3 hours. So at 4 o'clock in the morning, I'm out in that kitchen in that leather chair holding this little tiny lamb.
So this is Heidi.
Feeding her, and then the two of us would fall asleep out there.
This is the one lamb the shepherd goes out to find.
And growing plants is marvelous, too. These little guys have been growing from seed in our greenhouse for months, and they are like children. And it's enormously satisfying to feed our customers.
We sell the produce through a CSA, community-supported agriculture, at very low prices.
People pay an upfront amount at the beginning of the season, and then every week, all summer long and all winter long, too, we supply them with a week's worth of vegetables.
We feed about 25 people out of that garden. The bed space is only 2,000 square feet.
As someone who has never myself been hungry, I'm completely committed to the view that those who are well fed need to think long and hard about how hunger is actually created and then how we solve it. And it seems to me the tools we've reached for have in some ways been the tools of technology and of trade and of control over nature and control over others. What we need to do is revalue food and food production. And we have to stop this idea that what nature gives us is for free and hence deserves a low commodity price. And we have to start thinking that what nature gives us is the most precious and is in fact the key to our sustainable continued existence in the world.
La tierra es un don de Dios para cada cultura.
For every culture, land is a gift from God. Without it, I don't think there would be any life for me. I think it's the same for you, isn't it? Where could you build your house? Where could you grow food to survive? The sacred earth sustains us, doesn't it? Like a mother who nourishes her child with her breast, so Mother Earth provides for us when there is a good harvest. and there's a portion for us, and there's a portion for our animals. Without the land, life wouldn't exist, would it?
Hi, we're back. This is the global politics of food. Before we go to part 2, want to review what part 1, Who's Invited, was about. Who's Invited are corporate giants like Archer Daniels Midland, Conagra, Cargill, and Monsanto, who control the world's food supply, and international institutions like the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, who set trade and economic rules that benefit large corporations at the expense of small family farmers. And now Cliff Bradley will introduce part 2, What's on the Menu.
That's good. We have created a situation where there's about 1 billion people in the world who don't have enough to eat, and as part 1 described, farmers who can't make a living. Part 2 is going to discuss some of these issues, and as Nan said, after this we'll have a short presentation by the panelists here, and we'll take your call in.
When we were recently in Seattle at the WTO, there was a tremendous amount of upset around the food system. And the question that everybody has to face now is, who is going to control it? Are we going to put the food we eat in the hands of millions and millions of small producers who have for thousands of years looked after the land and grown food? Or are we going to watch it being concentrated and controlled by fewer and fewer corporate players who are further and further away from the land, completely uninterested, for the most part, if you really look at it, in feeding the world, very interested in a high return on their investment?
It's no mistake that our food system has gone towards ever larger farms and fewer farmers on the land. It's not an accident and it's not inevitable. It's the direct result of about 4 decades of very deliberate government policy and investment. I would also say that it's not just food production alone that's driving small farmers off their land in the United States, off their land in the developing countries. It's also food consumption. The food, especially that we as Americans eat, has a tremendous impact on the world's environment and on the employment of people, millions of people throughout the world. When we walk into a grocery store and buy something, we don't think about who produced that, what kinds of working conditions they're subjected to, whether or not they were driven off their land and are now tenant farmers. We don't think about that. And I think we need to. I think we need to understand that our meat consumption is driving devastation of the rainforest and putting farmers out of business. The flip side is that our food choices can absolutely support a sustainable system that's good for everybody, that's good for the planet, that's good for local farmers, that's good for the economy. And that's where I think people need to be going, whether it's to community-supported agriculture, to farmers markets, to talking with their grocery manager about getting more regional, local food. I think all of those are options that people need to be looking at more and understanding how positive a change that can make.
If you take one like this, that won't hurt it. Get about 10 of those. They're just what you'll need. Delicious.
Conscious eating goes beyond food to support the rights of small farmers and really the rights of citizens everywhere to make their own decisions about not only what they're eating, but about their lives. Sovereign rights, the local decision-making control is really the heart of the issue in the future of the food system.
I think it would surprise a lot of North Americans to find out that about 65%, or in some estimates more, of the food that they eat has some ingredients in it that have been genetically modified. GMO products. You might want to know, because it's real intimate. I mean, it's going to be right inside you, literally. You might want to know. For consumers, you're being told that you will have better food in the long term. For example, the fish gene introduced into the tomato was supposed to give it a longer shelf life. What is it about the tomato that lasts such a long time with the fish gene in it that is so wonderful? And it's this. It's the possibility of moving foodstuffs, controlling foodstuffs and moving them for profitability into more and more places. I mean, the long-lasting shelf life is only of interest to you if you've got a long way to take that tomato and you need to store it for a long time. It's everything to do with profitability for corporations and very little to do with farmer profitability, with consumer well-being, or anything else. And it has nothing to do with environmental care. What we've done with genetically modified organisms is such a fundamental change that it's ludicrous to think that we have any real ideas of what the consequences will be. The risks are enormous. In terms of the food you eat, is it as safe as other food? We don't know. The corporate players that are doing the propaganda around this are very quick to say, look, it's biotechnology. We have done biotechnology forever. Why are you worried? This is just another tool.
When we talk about biotechnology, the part of it that's controversial is genetic engineering. Nobody's concerned about fermentation to produce yogurt or beer or a number of other things that might fall under the general term biotechnology. What's controversial is taking genes from one species and putting them into another where they would never be found in nature. These effects could be very environmentally dangerous. Imagine an insecticide gene moving out into wild weed populations and wild habitats and beginning to affect the food chain by killing enormous numbers of wild insects, which are not pests of crops, but which are the basic food for other animals, for birds. We have no idea what the ecological consequences would be. By the same token, there are enormous unknown health risks. You put a new gene into a new genetic background, yes, it may do one thing that you want, but it also will be interacting in unknown ways with other genes and other metabolic pathways, and therefore may cause new products to be produced inside the cell. These new products could be an allergen, it could be a toxin, it could be a carcinogen. There may not be a problem, but we don't really know if it's not tested. And unfortunately, the Food and Drug Administration has required no mandatory health testing for any genetically altered foods.
An American farmer will produce a healthier grain, and an African farmer can provide better for his family. Because biotechnology researchers test and test to find new solutions.
There is, I think it's a $500 million media effort on the part of the biotech companies to really enhance the profile of biotech. And I think that as with any technology, the crucial issues are who makes the decisions and who's benefiting at whose expense. And so much of what's going on in biotech is being done at the expense of indigenous peoples all over the world.
For millennia, farming families in the third world have saved seed from year to year, and farmers have always saved the seed from the best plants the previous year to use the next year. And so over generations, centuries, millennia, today's different crop species were developed by small farmers who chose the best characteristics for generation after generation.
This cocoa, my uncle planted it. I replanted the small ones, you see, and married them together. This one is very, very sweet.
That's a lot of work and a lot of investment that peasant communities around the world have put into today's food supply. It wasn't until a few years ago when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that life could be patented that a new situation arose, which many people call biopiracy. That opened the door for giant biotechnology companies to take these different seed lines, these different crop varieties developed by farming communities over millennia, and patent them and say, basically from now on, if anybody uses this variety, they have to pay us for it because it's become our private property. This is called intellectual property rights by companies who say that it's their right to be able to do this because they put intellectual effort into identifying and saying what the gene sequence is. But farming families and farming communities in the third world say this is biological piracy, this is biopiracy. Our ancestors developed this and nobody has been compensated for it.
We cannot patent life. You cannot come here and patent the West African cocoa flavor. And if you go ahead and patent the West African cocoa aroma, and it leads to a decimation of the livelihood of so many people, then we cannot be talking about the West being a partner in poverty alleviation in the developing countries. There will be another war, not a war for decolonization, but a war to free ourselves from their intellectual and scientific dominance.
If you talk to people who are working directly with the poor, you just hear story after story of how much harder life is becoming, how much harder to get access to food, to find a job that pays a living wage. The major link between globalization and increased poverty and hunger comes through the corporation. Those of us in the movements increasingly talk about corporate globalization because it is the consolidation of corporate power, the consolidation of economic activity under corporations that is the key to creating the inequality. There's lots of public relations from corporations, massive advertising telling us about how their concern is with the environment, with creating jobs, with creating prosperity for all people. But you look behind that and you read the financial pages, or you hear what corporate CEOs talk about in their own forums. And what they're talking about is that our fiduciary responsibility is to our shareholders, and it is to maximize their short-term returns. They can be fired by the shareholders if, in fact, they're not really focused on the immediate short-term bottom line, getting the stock price up. Now, then you look at the participation in stock ownership. And again, we get the message that, well, when the share prices go up, everybody benefits. But if you look at it globally, I think it's very reasonable to estimate that probably no more than 1% of the world's population has any kind of consequential ownership of shares, which means that these corporations that control so much of the economy, their function, their legal responsibility is to capture as much of the wealth as possible out of the global economy and shift it over into the bank accounts and the stock portfolios of this 1% of the population. We've created a corporate-dominated economic system that is going around, where can we find the cheapest labor to exploit? Where can we find forests that we can cut down and turn into paper chips? Where are the last remaining fish that we can send our trawlers out to harvest? The corporate system, being attuned only to those financial indicators, is simply not attuned to these indicators of the state of health of the planet or the state of health of society. And in fact, it is mining the living wealth of the planet, mining the living wealth of society in order to turn it into money so that the very rich can compete for a higher ranking in the Forbes list of the world's richest people.
And that's what the global trade is really about, who gets to use whose resources from all around the world. You see, the decimation, that kind of agenda creates for the people and the cultures. And that's another part that I think we just ignore. That's another part of the interrelatedness that I keep coming back to. We ignore, I think, what kinds of cultural losses we're suffering. We're not just suffering losses in terms of soil degradation, in terms of people from the land, in terms of water quality. We're suffering a very acute cultural loss. As we move to monocultures, I'm not talking just wheat fields now, I'm talking about monocultures in terms of urban, global, McDonald culture. As we move towards that in spades, we lose the thousands, the millions of cultural nuances and the diversity, which I think in the end is absolutely necessary for our survival as people. I'm part of an organization here in Canada, the National Farmers Union, which is part of a global peasant movement, the Via Campesina. So I have the privilege of sitting around the table with peasant leadership from many of those places in the world where the majority of the people are farming people. And everywhere the story is the same. We're no longer supposed to focus on growing food to feed ourselves and the people around us. We're supposed to grow commodities for an international trade. So then I'm in Honduras working with some farmers, and the advice to them is you have to stop growing beans and start growing chili peppers because that has an international market. It's a cash crop. That's how you get ahead. And one of the peasant leaders said, "But what will my children eat? I can't feed my children chili peppers. We have to have beans." And I'm sitting there as a Canadian farmer saying to myself, that's us. We're bigger. We grow for an export market. We're highly industrialized. And you know what else I need to tell these people? We can't make a living doing this. We're the success story on this treadmill, and we can't make a living.
The state of Punjab, which is a fertile state, the most fertile state in India, called the Granary of India, produces wheat, but most of it is used for feeding dogs and cats of Europe. The state of Haryana, which is the next fertile state, it produces tulips instead of feeding its own people. There's also the focus on growing cash crops such as sugarcane, cash crops such as cotton, which basically are draining water from the groundwater. And these are the states which are facing drought every year. At the same time, when people do not have access to drinking water, Coca-Cola is buying up local wells in states of Maharashtra and Gujarat. So basically everything which is sacred to life, whether it's food, whether it's water, everything is being commodified. And when you meet people on the streets who are feeling the day-to-day frustration, they'll tell you what's going wrong. They know where these prescriptions are coming from. They know they're coming from the World Bank, they're coming from the IMF, they're coming from this body called World Trade Organization.
It's very hard to find any actions taken by the World Trade Organization that actually regulate trade. What they're actually regulating are governments, prohibiting governments from putting any restriction on trade that might interfere with the freedom of movement of some global corporation, working from the premise that any corporation, simply by its existence and by the fact that it controls enormous wealth, has an unalienable right to engage in business in any country, to access whatever natural resources it finds it profitable to access, and to sell whatever products it finds useful, no matter what the consequences may be for health or for the environment.
I hold the corporate system culpable. I wouldn't want to say that I hold the individuals culpable. Rather, it's a kind of economic and legal system that has allowed corporations to get too large and to have each sector of the economy dominated by only one, two, or three. It just invites collusion. It invites corrupting of politicians. It leads to good people doing bad things. Perhaps we see the most scary version of that in factory farming of animals. Farmers who want to produce hogs or who want to produce chickens today can pretty much only do it if they sign an exclusive contract with one of 3 or 4 giant companies, for example, ConAgra or one of its subsidiaries in hogs, or for example, Purdue and poultry. That contract requires that they construct at their own expense factory-like facilities where the animals are basically stacked on top of each other. When you have animals out on a pasture, a disease doesn't pass very easily from one to the other. When you have them in a high population density, highly stressed on top of each other, diseases race through the factory facility. The farmer has to continually pump the animals up with antibiotics. This creates a perfect environment to create diseases resistant to antibiotics.
They're raised in conditions which tell us only one thing, and that is that we don't view those as part of creation. We view those strictly as objects for our use and control and propagation.
So many times in the past, either out of good intentions or sometimes out of bad intentions, we have exported ways of doing things to the third world that have ended up making things worse. Whether we're talking about industrial agriculture, destroying the environment, driving peasants off the land, whether we're talking about arms we've sent to the third world, I think if there's one thing we've proven is that we do not know best about what's good for other people. Many of the problems, perhaps even most of the problems in the third world, originate with institutions based right here in America. What we should do as Americans is make companies based in our country accountable, is make our government serve the interests of the majority of Americans and not the interests of a tiny group of corporations. We really don't know best, and we have to start realizing that there are strong movements in third world countries.
We have seen the farmers' movement in India, when almost 500,000 farmers marched on the streets of Delhi to demand justice, to say no to agricultural clauses in the World Trade Organization.
What is very exciting is the extent to which you're seeing solidarity developing among grassroots groups across the world, across national boundaries. This is what many of us call the globalization of civil society, which is a very positive side of globalization. But this is about people waking up, discovering their own energy, the sources of their own power, the possibilities to act cooperatively around the idea that ultimately all people in the world share the same interest in creating a society that works in balance with the planet and a society in which we live in peace with one another.
My greatest hope comes with the young people in the world because they have the power to change the situation. And I think that as people not involved in farming come to understand the very high stakes of what's going on and the costs of the loss of small farms worldwide, that they will continue to work together and realize that what has been happening is not inevitable, and that we can make choices to create conditions that are very different. That for example, trade rules that are supporting large-scale industrial farming can be written so that they, in fact, support small-scale farming, or at least don't pursue their destruction. And I feel that the hope and confidence for that is rising. And partly it's because groups as diverse as farmers, nonprofit groups, what are called non-governmental groups, indigenous peoples and farm workers and trade unions and labor And environment and church and consumer movements truly around the world have all found that they have common ground on this.
A few years ago, people would have said it's not possible to buck the trend towards free trade. I personally feel a tremendous new hope in the power of the citizenry around the world to say no. These are policies that only benefit a tiny minority of very powerful corporations and that are hurting everybody else.
A loaf of bread that cost about 94 cents. The farmer's share of that was 3.5 cents. And it cost the wheat farmer about 6.5 cents to produce the wheat that's in that loaf of bread. Now, is it any wonder that corn farmers and wheat farmers are going broke?
I think the whole conversation around food security and hunger is only a cover page and no book at all, unless you fill the script with the voices of women. That's the real story, because it's always the women who are in the gardens and in the kitchens struggling to grow food and prepare food to feed their children. We need to ask, how do women see food security, and what would they do to ensure that their children and their family have food?
Those are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking. We need to be looking at agriculture and food production as a basic necessity for life, the way we look at water that must be protected for all of us to survive.
Changing this depends as much on a spiritual awakening as a political awakening. Rediscovering that we are, in fact, part of the web of life of a living planet. And if there is to be any future for any of us, we have to focus on creating a cooperative global economy, not a competitive global economy, but a cooperative global economy that is geared to assuring everyone a decent means of living. Not a global economy that is geared to the competition of the strongest against the weakest. Global corporations coming down from above to suck the resources, to suck the life out of the community and turn it into money. People often ask me, do you think we'll work our way out of this? I avoid making any prediction because I don't think it's a matter of prediction. I think it's a matter of choice.
Hi, we're back. Welcome to the Global Politics of Food. You have just seen part one, Who's Invited, and part two, What's on the Menu. And now we're having the panel discussion with Cliff Bradley, Larry Evans, and Neva Hassanen.
Thank you, Nan.
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot one more thing. This is a live call-in show, and the telephone number is MCAT 542-6228. That's 542-6228. There it is on the television. Okay, and sorry, Cliff, to interrupt you. Here's Cliff.
Yes, well, that was a good interruption. We need people to call in and discuss these issues with us. I wanted to just briefly discuss for a few minutes some of the political ideas that were presented in this video, because the subtitle actually was The Politics of Food, and that's the solutions are in politics and the problem was in politics. So there's a couple points I'd like to make about this. First, that we need to remember, as the video pointed out, that hunger, global food inequities that were described in the video are a result from political policy decisions. These things don't just happen. They're created by the institutions and corporations that dominate this system. That hunger is not inevitable. It can be changed. Most people probably don't realize, but that world hunger really doesn't result from a shortage of food or food production. It results from a lack of money. People are hungry because they don't have money to buy the food that's there. And again, that's a result of trade policies and economic policies, not a result of agriculture. And as an example, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization published a statistic recently that 78% of malnourished children in the world, that's 78% of all the malnourished children in the world, live in countries that actually export food. These people are hungry and they live surrounded by food. And these are a result of the policies that have been instituted by the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund. These people, you know, Cargill and Archer Daniel Midlands have a place at the World Trade Organization. I dare say the people watching this video do not. And that's one of the things that we need to correct. And those are political corrections, nothing to do with technology or increasing food production. There are several issues in front of our U.S. Congress that affect these issues, or the things described in this video, that are being voted on as we speak by our congressional representatives. The fast track and free trade area of the Americas that would expand the NAFTA free trade agreement, so-called free trade agreements between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. This legislation would expand this to all of Latin America, or all of the Western Hemisphere. And these policies have been disastrous for U.S. and Mexican farmers. And we're about to, the Senate will vote in the next month or so on legislation to expand, that would give the President power to expand these trade agreements to all of the Western Hemisphere. The Farm Bill that is coming, they're voting on amendments now to the Farm Bill. And this is the legislation that provides subsidies, described in the film, based on how much land you own, so that huge corporations exist and get enormous agricultural subsidies while real farmers who work their own land receive nothing. And that's in legislation that's going to be voted on in the next few days in the Senate. And finally, one of the really odious things that in the world is the tremendous burden of debt that third world countries, developing countries live under, that's been instituted by, again, the international institutions, International Monetary Fund. The U.S. government controls these institutions and has the power to relieve that debt, to let these countries have the resources to develop their own economies rather than try to supply the U.S. with cheap export food as a way to pay off massive international debt. So these are things that can be corrected by people getting involved in the political system in this country. It's not a problem that's overseas, that's unreachable. It's something that Senator Max Baucus and Senator Conrad Burns and Congressman Rehberg vote on in our Congress. So that this is one of the points I think that really needs to be made strongly from this video.
Yeah.
Hi, and now we have Larry Evans. He's a mycologist and the owner of the New Black Dog Cafe.
There you go. Hi. I'd like to take this from the perspective of a local businessman myself. I think that it's important to realize that everyone here who's working, who's eating basically in America, is involved in a two-tiered system of local versus global food production. And what exactly am I trying to say here? Basically that I buy my produce and my meats locally, and in order to do that I have to pay the producer an acceptable amount of money so that they can survive here in the American economy. Whereas a large corporation, let's say McDonald's for example, can go and buy Argentinian beef at 35, 45 cents a pound. I'm in the situation of trying to buy beef on the local Montana market, which means that locally raised hamburger that's been raised here and turned into hamburger here in Montana comes closer to $1.50 or $2 a pound. And we're both trying to turn out a sandwich that falls somewhere in the $3 or $4 range for your lunch. I think it's important to notice that we've been talking about a free market system or free trade, and that it's not fair to use the word free in these regards if you have a market that is being manipulated or a government that's being manipulated. For example, if I'm upset with the amount of taxes that I pay or the surcharges that are involved in some aspect of my business, I've got to pretty much grin and bear it. But if I'm a multinational corporation and I've got a few $1 million to throw around, buy a golf vacation in the Bahamas or something, I can pretty much expect that pesky little subsidy problem to go away with a couple of well-placed congressional votes. One really good example of this is that, I don't know if you've been noticing the news, but recently in Australia, they, after much debate, they passed a law that required genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, that are present in the food chain had to be labeled. The very next day, Australia's 2 main food producers came out and declared themselves to be 100% GMO free. In other words, they were not going to buy any more genetically modified organisms. So you can see the undercurrent of public opinion is very much against eating genetically modified foods of any sort. I think anyone listening can probably, hey, here's a quick test. If you had a choice between eating genetically modified foods and organically raised foods, which would you prefer? The overwhelming choice of most people around the world is to eat the natural product rather than some manipulated product that has never been tested. And I repeat, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, our government, does not require and has not tested genetically modified organisms for safety. There's no requirement for them to do that. And when you see that the overwhelming response in this regard is against putting this type of stuff in your body, it's easy to see why the large corporations would be extremely concerned to avoid this sort of labeling. One other thing that really concerns us here is, and another example of government manipulation, is who gets the patent for these specialty foods and other things. Are we looking at the farmers who have raised traditional crops and modified these heirloom varieties to be very specific disease resistant or climate adapted types of foodstuffs? Or do we issue the patent to the corporate representative who goes to the village, spends a couple days, snags a handful of seed, and brings that seed back into the United States? To issue a patent to an individual who literally took a finished product and rushes it to the patent office and ignore the claims of people who spent generations developing this seed stock, to me turns the entire concept of intellectual property on its head. You're defending the pirates in this case and not the producers or the true owners of this intellectual property. And so when you see that sort of manipulation, this does not generate faith among people in the system when you see this sort of change. Other than that, I think it's important to remember that we have to avoid oversimplification in the realm of genetically modified organisms. We have a very common, what should we say, perception that the genome or the genes of an organism are a blueprint. And this is a fine analogy, but it's woefully incomplete, because if you if you look at it, the gene is more like a history book or a recipe than it is a blueprint. You can't simply shove a couple genes out of the way and insert this tuna fish gene in the middle of the soybean and expect it to have no change at all. Any more than you could suddenly decide to put Abraham Lincoln back in the Revolutionary War period and free the slaves in 1776. You can't possibly predict the changes that will occur when you're manipulating things on this level. This requires serious testing, and this testing simply isn't being done. So, Neva?
Well, it's hard to follow up on Abraham Lincoln, but I'll try. The thing that this video really says to me is that it reminds us that food is central to our lives. And yet most of us know very little about where our food comes from, how it was produced, what the environmental impacts of the food production was, or of the transportation to bring it to us. And you know, who produces our food? We know very little about these things. And today, to eat is to really participate in this truly global food system, and that's really what this video illustrates very well. This is especially true here in Montana. And it wasn't always this way. About 50 years ago in Montana, 70% of the food that was consumed in the state was raised here. And we raised a wide variety of vegetables and other crops and fruits, peaches and apricots, watermelons, strawberries, asparagus, celery, beets, cabbage, apples, carrots, onions, potatoes, and on and on. We produced a nutritionally adequate diet here in the state of Montana when you combine all these fruits and vegetables with the grains and beef and other meats that are raised here. Also, about 50 years ago, Montana had a vibrant food processing sector. And in fact, food processing was the -- job sector in the state in the 30s and 40s. But today, that's changed a lot. And there are about 15% of the food eaten in Montana is actually raised here today. And most of the food processing sector is gone. That's pretty amazing in a state that grows about 60 million acres of food. And today Montana's agriculture is much less complex and diverse than what it was historically, which makes it more vulnerable, not only ecologically but economically. Most of our food is exported out of the state. For instance, we raise about 170 million bushels of wheat a year. 80% of that Montana wheat crop is exported primarily to the Pacific Rim countries. Montana has essentially become what I like to call a food colony. Fortunately, though, things are starting to change, and I hope we get a chance to talk about this a little bit more, but there are a lot of people around the state who are trying to rebuild our local agriculture, make it more diverse, connect producers and consumers, and relocalize the food system here in Montana. And to me, this speaks to the fact that people can shape the food system, and as eaters, we all have rights and responsibilities when it comes to food. And we don't have to allow corporations to dictate what our food system is going to look like. We can participate in those decisions as well, and we must participate in those decisions. Food is not only a basic need, but it's also cultural, and it's a way in which we connect with one another, and it's a way in which we connect with the natural world. Nothing could be more important than food. And so I really hope that we can talk a little bit more this afternoon about how we can go about reshaping the food system in a way that respects both people and the land and rebuilds and revitalizes our communities here in the state.
So again, the telephone number is 542-6228. That's 542-6228 here in the MCAT studio.
So, hey, you know, Cliff, I was interested in your comments earlier regarding the number of players or the number of corporate players that are controlling the food market that we're looking at today. I wondered if you could expand on that and tell us a little bit more about what has happened and how the number of grain peddlers, so to speak, and the number of actual food producers has changed in the time that you've been in the business.
I think when I first started working and being interested in agriculture, there were probably close to a dozen major grain companies in the world, and it's just been a consolidation like's happening in a number of most industries, that our economic system rewards and subsidizes large at the expense of small and diverse, large and undiverse, I guess, and to where, as I say, there's now 3 companies that basically control the world's flow of grain, and that's happening in the other sectors too. I mean, there used to be, companies that were doing, developing and marketing pesticides. There used to be, when I first started in the biological pest control business 10, 12 years ago, there were a couple dozen of these companies, and in the last 10 years they've merged, bankrolled each other, reorganized, spun, created these enormous life sciences companies that they call them, that control not only agricultural chemicals but also antibiotics and medical technologies. And these are the people that are doing the genetically modified crops. I mean, these are the ones that are, Monsanto and Novartis, who's soon to be Syngenta. They're going to merge with a large British company here pretty soon, or in the process of merging. These are the people that are bringing us the genetically modified crops. We hear a lot about GMO crops and where they're coming from and how they're going to feed the world and all this sort of stuff. And it's basically 5 companies that are doing the whole thing, and it has nothing to do with feeding the world. They're not developing new food technologies to sell to people who make $1 a day. They're selling products that make it more convenient to spray herbicides, for example.
It really concerns me that we're involved in a non-sustainable agricultural situation. In my travels in Japan, I was able to visit rice fields that have been under constant cultivation on an annual basis for almost 6,000 years. And in my own home state of Illinois, we have the rather unsettling bit of information that since John Deere invented the steel plow in 1872, that the state of Illinois, the average loss of topsoil has been about 18 feet. So figured out about 125 years of our intensive sort of agriculture has cost us 18 feet of topsoil in some of our most productive farmland in the nation. And at the same time, we have, we're not moving to preserve the land in a way that it will be agricultural land at all in the future.
Sounds like there's a caller.
Take a call there.
Okay, looks like we have a caller on line 1.
Push that button.
Hello, caller, are you there?
Push 1.
What happened? We had a caller left. Sorry, caller. Please try again. Okay, the number is 542-6228. This is the Global Politics of Food. It's a live call-in show.
You got somebody on the line there, don't you?
Looks like we got somebody on the line. Okay. Five 542-6228 here in the MCAT studio. Okay. Okay.
Well, I could pick up on this point about genetic engineering. One of the things that I think is really important to note is that we have always had plant breeding, but that today we can redesign nature with a speed and precision that we've never known before. And this is really critical to understand, that this is very different than traditional plant breeding. Modern biotechnology allows us to take genes from one species and put them into another species. And this raises really important ethical questions as well as questions about safety and in terms of human health and the environment. And so the fish and tomato gene splicing that's gone on, for instance, is a classic example of this. And I think we really have to talk about this as a society.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like there's a caller coming in.
Looks like there's a caller on line 1.
Just one.
Press line 1 and then.
Just leave, don't push the other.
What happened? Okay. You guys want to do it?
No, just push the
You ready?
line, not the.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay.
What am I doing wrong? Okay, what about line 2? Okay. Okay, so we got a caller on line 1. Hello?
Yes, we have a caller who would like to ask, how could genetically modified wheat affect Montana?
Well, I could talk about that a little bit. Last year, there was a piece of legislation in the Montana legislature introduced by Representative Butch Waddill, which would have done two things. It would have put a temporary moratorium on the development and introduction of genetically modified wheat in the state of Montana until there could be a complete study of the impact that the development of genetically modified wheat might have on the state's economy. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, wheat is obviously a huge crop in our state. We produce 170 million bushels of it a year, and we're heavily reliant on exporting it to Pacific Rim nations, which are increasingly skeptical about genetically modified organisms and are not that interested in having them included in their diet. So if Japan, for instance, said they did not want to import wheat that had genetically modified organisms in it, this would have a great blow to Montana's economy. This bill was introduced, and it did make it through a committee, but then was killed. Unfortunately, you know, this to me is a great example of how corporate interests do not want to have a public discussion and dialogue and an informed debate about the introduction of these new technologies into agriculture. I literally watched representatives of Monsanto Corporation get up and oppose this legislation to study the impact of genetically modified wheat on the state of Montana's economy. So I think the basic answer to the question is we don't have a clue what the introduction of genetically modified wheat will do to Montana. We do know that the state is at risk, and we do know that right now scientists at Montana State University are developing a Roundup-ready wheat, which is a kind of wheat that will tolerate being exposed to the herbicide Roundup. This is being developed under a contract with the Monsanto Corporation at a public university, and I think that Montanans should be asking serious questions about whether this is a good use of our infrastructure at universities and why our legislators did not want to study the impacts on our state.
Sounds like we're being intentionally kept in the dark on this.
Yeah, we're stumbling in the dark, that's for sure.
And there's actually a pretty clear precedent for what will happen economically. in the last 5 years or so with the introduction of genetically modified corn and soybeans in the Midwestern United States. I'm not sure about soybeans, but I recently read figures for corn. Much of the U.S. feed corn, a substantial amount of U.S. feed corn was exported to Europe. And Europe does not want genetically modified corn. There's no way to really effectively segregate genetically modified corn from regular corn in the system. They're trying to develop ways to do that now, but that costs the Midwestern United States 20% of their corn exports, and that's one reason why the price of corn has been in the tank for the last several years.
Well, and just to add to that, we had the Starlink fiasco last year, which is where corn that has been genetically modified and approved for use on livestock was mixed with corn that is intended for human consumption, even though Starlink corn is not intended for human consumption. It is not approved for that use by the government. And yet the marketing system has not been able to keep these products separate. The government didn't think about that fact when they allowed these products to go onto the market. That's part of the reason why the corn market really dropped precipitously in the Midwest.
Well, and I think there's more than one aspect to this too. Not only is it difficult to segregate it after the seed has been harvested, but it's also equally, if not more, impossible to prevent pollen from drifting. We've got two cases that have come up in the last couple of years, I think, that illustrate this point. One is Percy Schweitzer, I believe, Schmeisser, up in Canada, who is an organic canola or rapeseed farmer, and he saves his seed and uses his seed to replant with, and because of pollen that drifted over from genetically modified organisms grown by farmers that were not even neighboring farmers but far removed, the pollen drifted into his field, and as a result contaminated his completely natural canola crop with genetically modified organisms. Now, Monsanto's gone to court in this and actually won a ruling against him for stealing their genetically modified rapeseed stock. And the reasoning behind this being that he must have somehow gotten it, as long as their genes are present in his seed, they own his seed, and they've actually won a ruling that makes him have to pay for the fact that their genetically modified pollen blew into his field, therefore contributing to a change in his crop that he never was interested in having. So
yeah, it's basically a case of genetic pollution, and you're sort of blaming the victim in that case. It's outrageous.
I agree. I have a question. What about when people go to the grocery store and they notice that commercial produce costs less than organic? I mean, what's the real spiel with that?
Probably a lot of a good part of it is the way we measure economics, and efficiency, that we call it efficient, and our economic systems measures it as economically efficient to grow a tomato in Mexico that's grown with pesticides and
imported water,
massive amounts of fertilizer, minimal care of the soil. We put those tomatoes on a truck and transport them 1,500 miles to Montana and Albertsons or wherever, and we have a system of subsidies and rewards for bigness and trade that make that tomato economical. When if you actually measured the cost of 1,500 miles of diesel fuel to bring you a tomato is absurd. But that's a lot of it, and an organic tomato that's grown locally doesn't fit that definition of efficiency, because it's somebody who's trying to get paid a real wage or a real income rather than using displaced indigenous people from the south of Mexico to grow tomatoes or do all the labor for $3 a day in a tomato field in the north of Mexico. So it is, in that system of measuring efficiency, it's more expensive to produce an organic tomato.
Economic accountability,
yeah,
basically.
If you put the real cost of what it costs to bring us socially and environmentally and economically to bring a tomato from Mexico, an organic tomato produced in a greenhouse in Montana would be much cheaper, but we just don't measure those costs. And that's one of the real failings of the institutions that were talked about in the video. The World Trade Organization doesn't measure anything other than the dollar efficiency of cheap labor in producing food.
Well, and the other thing is that in this country we subsidize, for instance, grain farmers, and that real benefit of that goes to the large global corporations that move grain around the world. It doesn't go to the farmer. Where basically farmers do not receive the cost of production when they sell their grain at the elevator, like in a state like Montana. And that's why we subsidize those farmers, because we want them to keep producing. But it's the benefit really goes to entities like Cargill. That keeps the price relatively low for consumers, but we pay for it through our taxes, through these subsidies that go every year, get approved and sent on to farmers. It's really not the farmer's fault, in my opinion. It's primarily a system that's designed to artificially lower the price of food in the marketplace, which is primarily to benefit the large global grain traders. Organic farmers, by contrast, have had some control over the price that they charge, and they're able to charge what it costs them to produce their product, and that's legitimate. People should receive a fair price in the marketplace, and if you go to a farmer's market, you can often find food that's as inexpensive cost-wise as food in in an Albertsons or a conventional supermarket. It's not always more expensive to buy organic if you can buy directly from the grower and you get to know the grower. In Japan, they call this food with the farmer's face on it. We need more of those connections between producers and consumers, and I think in the long run we'll see that economically that's as beneficial as well for people.
Oh, and I think, too, that we're looking at the fact that if you have a truly free market, you don't have subsidies. If we're talking about the concept of a free market, but what we're experiencing today is not a free market, but a market that is manipulated by the biggest players. It's the same situation we've seen in the stock market since the 30s. The big players get the heads up, they pull out, and the small investors get left holding the bag when the bottom drops out of the market. You've got a predictable up and down cycle with just about every commodity that you can name. And if you're able to analyze and predict this sort of change in commodity prices, then you can move to exploit these differences. The difference is that if you're allowed to buy and sell the entire amount of silver on the market or the entire crop of soybeans, there's a tremendous difference than if a single individual farmer buys or sells his own crop and nothing more. So I think it's important to realize this. We have in place in our economic system a system of accounting that assigns no value to a tree standing in the field, and yet assigns a dollar amount per board foot to a tree after it's harvested. As long as you have this sort of accounting system, you're never going to be able to truly represent the value of a standing forest or the value of a crop in the field. You can only evaluate the value of that commodity after it's harvested and at the particular moment that all the logs or all the grains are on the market.
Mm-hmm.
I have 3 questions.
3?
3. Well, I'll start one at a time. Number 1 is, I heard something about golden rice. Does anybody want to talk about golden rice? Golden rice and carrots?
Sure. Golden rice was a genetically modified version of rice that was developed as the solution to vitamin A deficiency in poverty-stricken parts of Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, some people suffer from vitamin A deficiencies, and severe enough in some cases to cause blindness, and it is a serious problem. But golden rice, to me, probably represents the complete and utter failure of the technological approach to these things. They took a gene from some other organism that codes for vitamin A and managed to get that stuck in a rice plant and expressed in the rice. And it colors the rice a little bit, so it looks a little bit golden color. And this was supposed, and that will be reintroduced to Asia to prevent vitamin A deficiency. The technical issue is there's not enough vitamin A in this rice to really make a difference to vitamin A deficiency. 1 carrot has more vitamin A than about a week's worth of golden rice. But to me, that really defines what the crucial issue is, that the issue is not, the question is not how to get more vitamin A in rice. The question is how come people in South Asia can't buy carrots? I read a listing in a book recently that there's something like 120 different kinds of root and leafy green vegetables traditionally grown in South Asia that a single serving will provide a day's worth of vitamin A. And it's because people have no money to buy those kind of vegetables, and because they can't buy vegetables, farmers don't grow them. And the solution is not to dump, golden rice that they can't afford in there. It's to probably, as Neva's saying, relocalize agriculture. That we need a system that allows farmers to make a living growing vegetables and provides enough of a decent income to people who can buy them. And that's political issues of land reform and adequate wages in industrial situations and land ownership and those sorts of issues. It has nothing to do with trying to genetically modify rice. I mean, it's...
And I think that Cliff has really hit on an important issue here, which is when we look at something like golden rice, what problem are we trying to solve? And, after the technology is developed, they'll say, well, the problem we're trying to solve is this vitamin A deficiency. But is that the best way to solve the vitamin A deficiency problem? And perhaps distributing more carrots would be a better approach. I personally believe that biotechnology is basically a tool, and that it can be used like a hammer. It can be used to hit somebody over the head with it, or it can be used to drive a nail. And the question is, who is controlling the biotechnology and the development of it? And as we've seen in this video, I think really eloquently, is that our whole global food system is increasingly controlled by these corporations that really don't have an interest in selling food to poor people, because the thing about people who are hungry is that they don't have much money. And these corporations are not going to make a lot of money off of selling food to poor people. So I think this is just a ruse to try to convince people that biotechnology is about feeding the world, when in reality, it's about corporate profits.
I noticed an interesting thing in my travels. I went to Bangladesh, and I think it's pretty well known. Bangladesh usually strikes up images of starving people and absolute destitution. And it really surprised me when I arrived in Dhaka that the cost of food there was about twice what it had been in India. And this really surprised me because the per capita expenses, as it were, in Bangladesh are roughly half that of India. And so common sense would lead you to believe that prices would be lower, not much higher. And as long as I was in the urban area, there was absolutely no answer to this perplexing question. But I did have the good fortune to head out into the countryside, and I visited some of the farmers there and realized that far from being the poverty-stricken area that we are led to believe, Bangladesh is actually an incredibly lush countryside. And the reason that people are not involved in the economic system is that they make at least 100% of the food that they need to consume right there on the farm. I visited some folks, they had nothing but an adobe house to live in, and yet the acre that they had around their farm, they were able to get 3 crops of rice a year. They had a jackfruit tree, they had a mango tree, they had several banana plants, a coconut palm, and they were actually able to get a very rich and varied diet year-round, we're in the tropics now, from this extremely small plot of land. As a result, they had no participation in the economic system, and this resulted in their being overlooked, or their existence kind of balancing out the, if you would, the numbers of people that were in the city and completely dependent on the excess production in the countryside. So, and I see, interestingly enough, I see the same thing here in Montana. What you were mentioning, Neva, earlier about, you know, what was it, up until the 50s, I believe, Montana produced virtually all the food that was consumed inside the state. Now we're net exporters. If Japan decides tomorrow that they're not going to buy any GMO wheat, and Montana's planted GMO wheat, we're not going to sell any wheat. What was it, about half, wasn't it, that half the Montana wheat crop goes to Japan right now? And if that is globally, you know, if that type of globalization persists, who's going to buy it? You can't hardly eat it yourself. Looks like get a phone call.
Okay, it looks like we got a caller, so.
Don't touch it.
Caller, are you there? Are you there?
I am.
Hi.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I'm wondering a little bit about the other side of our food chain in Montana, the meat side. And some of the reasons I got away from eating meat myself are because of the corporate aspects of the meat side of our food chain, and I'm wondering if anybody could address some of those issues. You've got pesticides, antibiotics, growth hormones, genetic modification in the meat supply. You've got all those intensive resource use of water and grains and so forth. Then also I'd be interested in hearing about the current corporate structure of the meat economy in Montana.
Who wants to talk on that? Thank you, caller. We appreciate your question.
Thank you.
Well, I guess I'll start with a little story. I used to live on a ranch north of Billings towards Roundup, and I learned a lot from those ranchers who have been working to, raising cattle for many years. But they have come to realize that the system in which they sell their calves really does not leave them very much. And I think what happens now is that most of the calves that are raised in Montana are shipped out of the state. They're shipped to feedlots, and they're primarily end up being slaughtered by one of 3 corporations that dominate the beef packing industry. What this means is that the producers have very little say over their own product once it leaves their gate and how it reaches the consumer. And in these feedlots, when they end up in the feedlots, that's where you get heavy uses of hormones and antibiotics, because the system's not very clean and you have a lot of animals in one concentrated place, so they give them routine antibiotics and so on. My own concerns about eating meat really are around this same issue as the callers, which is the corporate control of the meat industry, and less about the actual ethics of eating meat. I think here in Montana, raising cattle on grass could be a sustainable practice if it's done correctly. Not all grazing systems are the same. So I think that's one thing to look at. The other thing we're seeing is that in the meat industry, you not only have fewer and fewer corporations just in the beef sector, for instance. Those same corporations are getting into chickens and turkeys and pork, and so you see this is like a horizontal integration in the meat sector. Now, this past year, for instance, Tyson, which is well known as a leading producer of chickens, bought out IBP, which is Iowa Beef Processors, which is one of the largest beef processors. So what we're going to end up with is very few corporations, not just within each sector, but across the board. So this is something to be very concerned about, I think. And what it also means is that we have basic raw materials, in this case calves or lambs, that are being shipped out of the state, and the producers aren't getting much return for that.
One aside on this as well, I think, is that, interestingly enough, Montana is probably one of the few places where you can actually buy locally grown beef over the counter. I know that for my cafe, we're able to buy locally grown organic beef here. I am in contact with half a dozen ranchers throughout the western part of the state alone who provide me with all the organic beef that I can possibly serve, and I know that the Good Food Store also has a supply. So we're really lucky in Montana that we do have the option of buying meat, what should we say, directly from the farm. So,
unfortunately, though, I would add to that, we have very few beef processing facilities left in Montana.
True.
And so it's a real challenge for the producer that wants to sell locally. Fortunately, there are some things that are changing in this area. There's a group of natural beef producers up in Flathead Lake area where people can buy direct from the producers and so on. But
Arrow's working on
right,
getting
we're
the
working on
distribution
this.
system
This is a really important project.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to say two things. One is that we have another caller, and the other thing is that Orange Street Food Farm has organic meat.
Great.
So
let's hear that.
Okay, so we ready?
Just the line.
Hello, caller, are you there?
I was wondering what kind of things are happening here in Montana that people can support that will help address some of these food issues.
Thank you, caller.
Well, maybe I could just quickly address this. One of the things that a group I've been involved in is doing is promoting buying direct from producers. I am on the board of the Alternative Energy Resources Organization, which is an organization that promotes sustainable agriculture in the state. We recently put out this directory called Abundant Montana, and what it is a directory of producers around the state, and it lists the products that they raise. Oh, look, I opened up to the new Black Dog Cafe. It's not only producers, but it's also cafes and stores where you can buy local food products. And these directories are free, and you can receive one by calling Arrow. Their phone number is 443-7272. They're based out of Helena. And get to know your farmers. This is a great way to travel around the state. You can arrange with people to pick up materials. I just recently bought some cherry apple cider from an organic grower up on Flathead Lake. You know, and it was delicious. Yeah, it's great. You should try. I should have brought some. So that's one thing people can do is buy direct, go to your farmer's market, join a community-supported agriculture program, and get involved in politics. I mean, Cliff was talking about that.
We've got really a lot of options in Montana if people pursue it. I mean, we're really lucky in this part of the country because there's so many places, you know, around the nation that you simply don't have that alternative. Right. But we do, and, you know, they need your support. You know, if people don't make that decision, then these people won't be able to continue doing what they're doing.
Okay, so it's time for a wrap-up. Do either
Cliff,
of you want to start the wrap-up here?
Well, I think that probably the wrap-up just continues from you know, what we can do about some of these issues. Again, I push on the political aspects of this. I mean, there's a number of groups or internet sites where you can get much more information on these issues, and I think that there's some of the organizations that were mentioned in the film. I know Food First is a very good organization for additional information. That was Peter Rossett that was in the video. They're www.foodfirst.org, and they have a lot of information, including information on legislation that's coming up that affects these issues, that affects food and food issues. And again, one of the other things that I think we're in some ways lucky about in Montana is this is a small state, and we can contact our Congress people and our senators and tell them what we think, and so become educated on some of these issues and call them up. I mean, giving our President Bush authority to negotiate trade, this is called fast track. He would like the ability to, and there's legislation coming before the Senate that would give President Bush the authority to negotiate all the details of trade agreements and then give Congress a yes or no vote on this. No amendment, no discussion, and that essentially leaves Montana, or a small state like this, out of any kind of decision in international trade. And Senator Baucus will be voting on this bill. Senator Burns will be voting on this bill. Call them up and let them know what you think. And so those are some of the issues some of the ways we can follow up, in addition to the politics of just understanding your local food supply and buying local. That works for the United States and will also work for the hungry people of the world. We need to relocalize agriculture as a way to feed people where they live.
I also want to add that I went to the store and I wanted bananas. They were out of organic. I didn't buy any bananas. I left that day without bananas because I only support organic. And it's time for us to wrap up. Okay, so I appreciate each one of you being here. I think this is a very, very important topic, and I encourage everyone to look at what we each can do, because there's so much we each can do. Look at it from a standpoint of empowerment. Look how many there are of us. There's like, what, 6.5 billion of us? There's a lot we can do, each and together. I also want to thank Mary Noel World Productions for the wonderful video, and Jubilee.
Need some food in my belly, need some drink for the dry in my throat, need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat. Don't you know it ain't right for people to go hungry with all the food being thrown away, just because it ain't the right size or perfect, cause you can't turn a fast dollar that way. You know it ain't right to make people grow coffee when their families could be growing food, working those lands for corporations. Don't do hungry people no good, cause people need food in their belly, need some drink for the dry in their throat, need for the world topsoil, and those burgers aren't fit to eat. And you know it ain't right to punish the farmers for growing food clean and poison free. There ought to be a government who protect them, put tax dollars where they need to be. 'Cause people need food in their belly, they need some drink for the dry in their throat, they need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat, got to have food in their belly, need some drink for the dry in their throat, they need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat. But you know we spend 25 million on a movie, not even worth being shown on TV. We spend $2 million on an airplane that we claim nobody else can see. Then we spend 800 billion on defensive, planning new ways to blow each other around. But even 1% of that budget could stop a whole lot of hungry sound. People need food in their belly, need some drink for the dry in their throat, they need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat, got to have food in their belly, they need some drink for the dry in their throat, need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat, everybody's in the same holy boat, everybody's in the same holy boat. Kinda makes me wonder if we're gonna stay